Welcome everyone. This is an extremely busy week in Ankara. There is G20, B20, T20, all of the 20s are meeting. So thanks for choosing us. We have a distinguished panel today which will talk on recently launched book by Reinventing Bretton Woods Institute. I have the copies of the book as well, but unfortunately they are stuck at the customs. So this is one of the things that G20 can get into, the customs problems. But still we have distinguished panelists. Mr. Amar BHATTACHARYA, who is a senior fellow at Brookings institution. Marc, chair of Reinventing Bretton Woods Committee. Mr. Bozkurt representing TEPAV. He is the head of the Trade Studies Center at TEPAV. Mr. Vasuki SHASTRY, he is the head of global public affairs at Standard Chartered, and Domenico Lombardi, who is the head of global economics program at CIGI. So I'm leaving the floor to Bozkurt Bey to have the opening remarks, and then we'll continue with the panel. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, it's indeed a great pleasure for me to welcome you to TEPAV. It's a special delight to be your host at this meeting, where we will be talking on the relaunch of the publication titled Bretton Woods, The Next 70 Years. It is the work of a special commemorative effort of reinventing Bretton Woods Committee by compiling 65 world-known political figures, prominent scholars. Among them, we're proud to see that our former Deputy Prime Minister, Ali Babacan, has also an excellent paper. We are indeed very fortunate to have Mr. Marc, UZAN, Executive Director of Reinventing Bretton Woods Committee, with us today. We are delighted to have all of you here to participate, share, and exchange ideas. Thank you for the interest you have shown. Thank you for coming here from near Ankara and far, all around the world. Ladies and gentlemen, please bear with me. I wish to make a few remarks. As somebody who has spent 8 years on multilateral trade issues, I cannot refrain from saying that the Bretton Woods institutions are not confined only to IMF. The World Bank, GATT, and World Trade Organization should also be taken into account. In other words, if we are to reinvent Bretton Woods, we also need to reinvent World Bank and the WTO. Then the question, are the World Bank and the WTO in a dire necessity to be reinvented? My short answer is absolutely yes. This morning, we will concentrate mostly on global financial stability and stick to reinvent the IMF. However, IMF's efforts alone, as it seems, cannot bring about a sufficient impetus to provide an improved level of financial stability in today's globalized world. In today's financial architecture, are all the major stakeholders or the actors allowed to make their contribution in correlation to their shares in the system? How particularly Chinese potential will be dealt in the coming days? We could ask the same question of the representation in the IMF for the other emerging economies as well as Turkey. The rising influence of emerging economies put an end to the preeminence of the industrialized economies, particularly after Quad, US, EU, Japan, and Canada. So the balance that was struck 70 years ago at Bretton Woods in today's world does not correlate to the facts on the ground and is considered as a source of asymmetry in the system by some. This is about today. Will tomorrow's economic reality be same as today's? So if we have to invent, we have to invent for the coming 70 years. Another issue is about trade. You could say that I have a fixation on trade issues. I can say that the shifting balances in international relations are first acknowledged in the swing of trade flows. In other words, the first signal in the change of the weight of the countries were always given by the trade flows. Thus, the fact that China became #1 exporter should be taken as an indication that it has a potential candidate to become #1 economy in the world in a short while. Now the point, what I'm trying to make here is that, are the major stakeholders, particularly the United States, ready to concede the weight that China will have in global financial stability in the coming days? During the last decade, we encountered some major crises that negatively affect financial stability. The 2008 financial crisis, the euro crisis, the slowing down of the emerging economies. Despite zero or even negative interest rates and massive infusion of liquidity into the system, the growth in the developed economies is, to say the best, is mediocre. In yesterday's international papers, the warning of IMF against rate rises by leading economies were widely reported. It is reported that IMF is calling for action, or better yet, non-action, to prevent growth rates from faltering even more. IMF asked the Federal Reserve, which is reflecting on rising US interest rates this month, not to be hasty. Suggested to European Central Bank to expand its program of quantitative easing, that means pumping more money into the economy, called on the Bank of Japan to get ready for further easing, and concluded that the risks to the health of the global economy had risen. We are witnessing a liberal system with negative interest rates. Isn't it clear? A capitalist system with negative interest rates. I am hoping that the Reinventing Bretton Woods Committee can create ideas in order to give a new impulse to the financial structure and help us see our future brighter. Let me make a final remark. This morning you have 5 speakers in front of you. And 4 speakers, including myself, are members of the Bretton Woods Committee. And I'll let you decide which one of us is not the Bretton Woods, which one of us is trying to reinvent the members here. Let me introduce Marc UZAN. My colleague has done it already, but I'll do it. Is the executive director of the founder of the Reinventing Bretton Woods Committee. It is not for profit, of course, and the organization has been established in 1994. He has edited numerous volumes on international finance, and he has also authored academic papers on the new architecture for the international financial system. He was a visiting scholar at the Department of Economics of the University of California, Berkeley, and currently visiting fellow at the Harvard University. Mr. Marc UZAN, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you very much for the introductions and also for your hospitality for accepting to host this panel for this release of the book, Bretton Woods, The Next 70 Years. I apologize. The book, I've been stuck in customs, but I can maybe give you just one copy that we were able to get, Bretton Woods, The Next 70 Years. And if all of you want to have a copy, please, at the end of the panel, maybe you can give me your business card and we'll be happy to ship a copy. Let me first, if I may give you just a little background about how this idea of the book came up, what we ask contributors to do, and after we will open the panel, I would like to thank Amar BHATTACHARYA, Domenico Lombardi, and Vasuki SHASTRY, who have been good friends, who have been following our work, speaking to different seminars we have organized. They didn't write specifically articles, but I felt that their expertise on the international financial architecture will provide some very good value and input to the current discussion that we have here at the G20 in Ankara, but also following next year China G20, where the issue of global governance will be very prominent. So 1 year ago, last June, we felt that at the time of the 70 years anniversary of the Bretton Woods Conference, there was few conferences, few commemorative meetings to try to see clearly what the future lies for the international monetary system. there was maybe a sense of fatigue, that the issue of global financial architecture has been on the agenda for many, many years, not only as the G20, as the IMF, and a feeling that it would be very, very difficult to reform, and we can clearly see how difficult it is to try to come up with a governance reform within the IMF. So we said, well, let's try to look at people who have been following this debate over the years, current ministers, current governors, former officials, former academic, and try to ask one specific question. And the question we asked the authors was the following one. What does the future hold for the world major currencies, the international monetary system, the institution that underpins the international financial architecture? What can be done to help steer a course toward financial stabilities? What challenge lie ahead? That was the questions we asked 1,800 words, so very specific, very short pieces. And we said it should be a very original article, and we commissioned all this article among ministers, and we got some very positive feedbacks. They agree on the deadline, and this is the outcome of this work. I will not, you will see on the book there is a summaries of each of the article, but I think the main theme that authors put out in the book was clearly the international monetary system, the future role of the IMF, international economy and international economic governance and policy coordinations. Also, issues related to the new set of institutions have been created on the global financial safety net side, the European Stability Mechanism, Shanghai Initiative, and also some reflections already on the new institutions that are been in existence, the BRIC Development Bank and the Asian. Nothing, no, because specifically the book is all about global finance. So we didn't put attention on WTO, but clearly on the IMF, and we let aside the World Bank. So my goal maybe today and on this very informal panel, and we hope to have interactive discussions here with the audience, is clearly from these three experts here that are going to contribute, I wanted to have maybe 2-3 main questions and to have really their reflections. One is we have been seeing, we have been talking for a long time, that it's very difficult to reform the global financial architecture. Over the course of the last 12 months, we saw 2 major events. One, the decision of China to set up a new institution called the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. This institution has been now created. They have named a president, Mr. Jinping, Chinese official. They have now 57 members. Second institution has been created is the BRIC Development Bank. Both are Chinese-based, one in Shanghai, one in Beijing. And within the BRIC Development Bank, we have also an important mechanism, the contingency reserve agreement, a type of swap line among central bank that might be, potential to create maybe something akin to an international monetary fund. So my first question to the panelists here: are this new set of institutions will challenge the current world financial order under the umbrella of Bretton Woods? Is it a frustration that has been very difficult to reform the international financial architecture that has, felt that China, under the leadership of China, decided to create a set of institutions, or are these institutions very specific to deal with one specific problem, mainly the issue of investment in infrastructure? So I will call first on Amar, for this first set of questions, and Vasuki and Domenico. The second aspect of the discussion will be clearly what happened during the summer. We have Chinese devaluation, we have a resolution of the Greek crisis for the moment, and I think people were taken by surprise that we might have also some spillovers coming from China, and the fact that shock transmitted are more and more important. So how people interpret the summer disruptive event, does it mean that we have to think about the world economy not only under Western-driven global financial architecture, but also that the fact that China's weight is so important? We were looking at it before more on the trade side, China becoming the largest exporter, largest importer, setting commodity prices. Now the transmission might be coming to the capital account. And on that, the background, remember, was China's willingness to join the SDR basket, which means, that the currency might be becoming more market-driven, which is going to happen. And the main generally discussed asset price that investors look was the euro-dollar. now we might be seeing that we are going to pay attention more to the renminbi. So in this context, the summer, how people react to the summer events, there's the weight of China, and how we will have an impact for the future of the international monetary system, at a time also where China's willingness to internationalize the renminbi. Last but not least, maybe we can conclude to see among our panelists how they see the prospect for global governance reform. Mainly, are we going to have the package, approved by U.S. Congress? And from that liaison is clearly how they see China forthcoming G20 presidency is the main theme. If China will pursue what I think was the plan, to discuss global governance, global reform, but with the current Chinese economic events, maybe the agenda might be shifted to try to understand if China, can trigger also global financial instability, or China will need to find, the common ground about how they need to discuss China economic prospect, but also putting something on maybe shaping up the global economic governance, because the weight of China might have an impact to change the architecture. So, Amar, if I can ask you maybe to kick off the discussion.
Maybe I should thank you before. Well, thank you so much for that. But I thought that you should be more forthcoming for the how this new architecture would be formed in the future.
Yeah, okay. After maybe at the end,
after maybe. Yeah. Now maybe I'll ask Amar Bhattacharya, a senior fellow of the Global Economy and Development Program at Brookings Institution. Mr. Bhattacharya had a long-standing career in World Bank. He was the focal point for bank's engagement with key international groupings and institutions, such as the G7, G8, IMF, OECD, and Commonwealth Secretariat. He might be the only civil servant in the world, I should say, who attended most of the meetings of the G20. You have the floor, Mr. Amar.
Thank you very much, Bozkurt Bey. I should say that probably the most significant qualification for being here on this panel is that I think I know Marc since 1995. So I think that's the most important qualification for being here in the panel, and I have watched his work very closely, and it has been a one-man institution with a very, very large network of important people. Also, for full disclosure, Marc did ask me to contribute to the report. It's just that, as always, I was too overcommitted, but I look forward very much to reading contributions. It's really a who's who. And if you look at the names on the report and you look at the work of Marc UZAN, of course, you are struck by how much, there has been evolution in the ideas of international monetary system and financial architecture during the period that even Marc has been focusing on. If you look at not just the Bretton Woods system, but the post 1971 period, there has been an enormous evolution away from a focus on, I would call, the monetary side alone, to a recognition that the financial sector is a central part of international arrangements, to a recognition that actually the whole macroeconomic space becomes important, as we have seen increasing focus on the fiscal dimensions right now, and a recognition that we are undergoing some important structural changes in the world economy that have major, major implications for the functioning of international institutions. I spoke a little bit about it yesterday, but let me just underscore a few points which I think are particularly relevant for this panel. The first is that we are undoubtedly experiencing today a major shift in the economic roles and weights in the global economy. Today it's fashionable, of course, to say that emerging markets are facing problems, there are difficulties and the like, but ultimately there is a major rebalancing of the global economy going on. With all the trouble that we are facing, emerging markets in developing countries still accounting for something like 70% of the growth component in the global world, and with it, an inexorable rise. Very encouraging, by the way, has been, I would say, the resilience of Africa and the resilience of African growth. Also underlying this structural change is a greater interconnectedness and spillovers. So, yes, there are spillovers through exchange rate policy, but as we have recognized, there are spillovers in equity markets, spillovers in the financial sector more broadly, and spillovers that are coming from politics now. So in a way, dealing with that also has become much more important. So let me comment from that perspective a little bit on the role of the fund, the role of the bank, and the emergence of these new institutions. And I'll just close with some brief remarks on the current conjuncture, both in terms of what I would call some risks, but also the need not to overreact. So on the role of the fund, the IMF has certainly, it's fair to say, reinvented itself. Not so, in a way, the IMF is done what the committee wants, which is reinventing Bretton Woods. This IMF has certainly reinvented itself by adapting its instruments of surveillance, by strengthening, in some sense, its focus on spillovers, and also in strengthening instruments that it has. But the area where the fund has been quite challenged is governance and resources. And let me elaborate. Okay, on the governance side, when the G20 was formed at the leaders level, and indeed even before when it was at the finance ministers level, a central goal was to bring about a major change in IMF governance. That goal has been met very partially. There was the reform of 2006, which in a way some of us argued at the time was not a reform, it was a backward step, because it only rewarded 4 countries, in a sense at the expense of other emerging markets and developing countries. Then we had the 2008 reforms, with it, a resuscitation of basic votes, but it really didn't bring about very fundamental changes. There was a hope that the 2010 reforms, and with it the forward-looking commitments, would bring about the kind of changes to really make the IMF ready for the 21st century. And as you know, those reforms have been held up. But what is more worrying is some of the underlying forces now, with kind of, what's happened in Europe, with the role of the US Congress, is that the likelihood that we will see these reforms not just implemented in the kind of letter of the 2010 reform, but continuing to adapt the IMF to the new realities remains, I would say, more uncertain than ever. So I think the governance side of the IMF really is kind of at risk. The second side, which I think is also at risk, is the resource side. One of the major outcomes of the 2008 financial crisis was a recognition that the IMF needed to be equipped with adequate resources to deal with the kind of global financial instability. There was a doubling of SDR resources that was agreed to at the time, and of course there was an agreement to double the size of quotas. But it was all, as the discussions proceeded, it became very clear that the arsenal of the IMF was not adequate. And because of the European crisis, there were 2 exceptional kind of contributions in terms of IMF resources: the new a replenishment and a refurbishment of the new arrangements to borrow, and then there was also special bilateral borrowing arrangements, which were actually, in some sense, significantly contributed to by emerging markets, including the BRICS countries. Now, these did help the IMF respond to the Asian crisis. But as, in some sense, not the Asian crisis, the European crisis, but as the pressures of that crisis has, from a resource point of view, diminished, the pressure to kind of make the fund adequately resourced is really, has diminished. And why does that matter? If you look at the advanced countries, what they did after the 2008 financial crisis is they went from an arrangement of limited swaps, about 600 billion or so, to essentially now unlimited swaps amongst the major central banks. So you have really a kind of an asymmetric world. Deep liquidity available for advanced economies, and the main institution which provides liquidity to emerging markets really lacking that, not only the liquidity, but the flexibility of fast response in order to be able to provide such liquidity. I've been quoted on this, so I don't mind saying it again. I sometimes call the IMF's lending facilities, particularly for this kind of crisis, the Virgin Mary facility. You have to really be very pure in order to be eligible for these facilities. And in a way, part of this is, to have a realistic view about the nature of contagion and shocks and to be able to have a system of response. It's partly in response to this asymmetry that you are seeing so much pressure coming from countries for self-insurance or regional pooled insurance. Okay, so reserves in the emerging markets and developing countries have never been higher, and as the CRA, not only of the BRICS, but many regional arrangements are being strengthened in order to respond. Now, I wouldn't say that they are a threat to the IMF, but if the IMF is not able, and not because of the IMF, but because of its principal shareholders, to really establish itself with a governance where emerging markets and developing countries feel they have an adequate role and voice, and with the resources to be effective, then yes, the challenges to the IMF will continue to grow. It will not be good for the IMF, and it will certainly not be good for the world as a whole. So that's the IMF. Now, on the development finance side, there has been an equally major shift in the past decade. And let me give a historical perspective. In the 1990s, the dominant philosophy, coming very much out of the US, was development banks really did not have a long-term role. That development banks should be replaced by private sector lending, and as soon as countries became eligible for private sector lending, they should graduate from the World Bank. And so the vision was very much that the World Bank should, in some sense, finish its purpose and role, and in a way, graduate countries. And this was then added to with another emphasis, which is the mission of the World Bank should really be to focus on the poorest of the poor, and from coming out of the Meltzer report, etc., a view that all of this should only be done on grants, and that lending itself really didn't have any role. On top of that, we had another phenomena that really crippled the development finance institutions, which was, in some sense, an overloading of conditions and of what people call safeguards. Very well intentioned, but the bureaucratic burden of that really became quite crippling for these institutions. As a result, the entire MDB system really became quite insignificant in a non-crisis sense. So if you looked at MDB lending during non-crisis years before the global financial crisis, it was barely positive. Maybe zero, maybe 1 billion, maybe 2 billion negative, but essentially insignificant. So it's the role of the development banks, which was such a central pillar, really had disappeared. The only time that the development banks figured was when there was a financial crisis. So when you had the Asian, Russian, Latin American financial crisis of the late 1990s, you suddenly see World Bank, MDB lending from the Asian Development Bank, Inter-American Development Bank spiking, going to very high levels. And the same thing happened after. So they really became like almost quasi-IMF institutions rather than lending for long-term development finance. Essentially, because as I said, the philosophy was the private sector could take care of this, and second, their procedures were just too cumbersome to lend, especially for the much-needed area of infrastructure. So what has changed? What has changed is a recognition in the last few years that probably the biggest area of development finance need is infrastructure. And this is not just a challenge for the poorest countries, it is a challenge across the board, including in most emerging market countries. And that in order to address that challenge, you have to address the demand side constraints, meaning policy, institutions, discretion risks and the like, but you also need to develop long-term financing in order to support long-term investments. I see Sergei Storchak sitting there, and I have to say that Russia, under its presidency, put long-term investment as a priority focus for the G20. And as the G20 focused on the long-term investment, it became very clear that while the potential for finance was very much from the private sector, you needed public sector actions to crowd in that finance, and the development banks had a huge potential role both to address the demand side as well as to augment the supply of long-term and appropriate cost financing. And as a result of this fundamental recognition and the impatience of emerging markets and developing countries, we had the creation of these two new institutions. Now, we have to look at all of this in perspective. The current spending of emerging markets and developing countries on infrastructure is about $2 trillion a year. It's dominated, by the way, by China. Okay? If you look at the future, all the analysts who specialize in this work, including myself, would say in order to meet the growth, structural change, urbanization pressures and the like, you probably will need to increase investment to the order of about $3.5 to $4 trillion a year. Very large sums of money. Within that, the entire MDB system provides about $30 to $40 billion in financing. So really very, very small. So even if their role is primarily catalytic, they are under, I would say, significant pressure to step up, in some sense, their contribution to beating this infrastructure gap and to doing it very differently, because the nature of infrastructure demand is also changing. Now, one area, by the way, that's also changing is on the supply side. If you look at Turkey, for example, it's one of the most competitive producers of infrastructure now in the world. China is another, Korea is another. The infrastructure supply now is an area of enormous innovation. And, one of the roles that multilateral development banks can play is also tapping the efficiency gains from this. So I'm very, very hopeful that the BRICS New Development Bank and the China-led Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank can introduce an element of contestability into this whole discussion. The need to do things innovatively, the needs to respect sustainability, and the need, in some sense, to ensure that we are not being held hostage to just a few voices in terms of global governance. So I do believe that we are at a moment of fundamental change in terms of both institutions. Let me just end with just quick words on the current conjuncture. So we are today living in a world of paradox. The first paradox is that interest rates have never been lower in the world. At the same time, investment has never been weaker in the world. So, you know, there is a free lunch to be had in terms of the real economy, but the world is unable right now to enjoy that free lunch. So that's the first paradox we have. Second paradox we have is interest rates are very low, but there is complacency with regard to risks in the financial sector. I mean, one thing we've learned, and again, I see Phil Turner there, and he has been a real guru of thought in this area, is when, you know, everything is calm, risks are quietly brewing. So you really need to worry, I would say, about the third thing is, you know, perhaps, you know, we put too much emphasis on on commodity prices as being a you know, huge you know, factor in terms of prospects of a bunch of countries. But ultimately, commodity prices benefit one set of countries and they cost another set of countries. So it's not a kind of it's not something which you can say you can blame for the global economy. Because if oil prices are so low, then certainly for a country like Turkey, which by the way has the largest import bill in terms of energy relative to GDP of any major country, it should be a huge benefit. Okay? So I think we are therefore living in a conjuncture, you know, which is kind of very special right now and, you know, potentially quite problematic. And in this, of course, we are seeing a lot of focus on China. So the Chinese, you know, situation is quite special. In a way, the impact of China really is perhaps not as much, should not be interpreted as strongly through growth as it should be through demand. Because ultimately, what is the impact of China on the rest of the world? You know, how much it imports from the rest of the world and what kind of spillovers that might emanate from financial, you know, vulnerabilities and the like. So on the kind of on the real economy part, I mean, you know, if you look at China, there are two things that really stand out. One is its rate of investment, you know, in the which is as a share of GDP. And the other is the flip side, which is the share of consumption in GDP. So, you know, in the United States, you know, of course, consumption rates 70%, in Europe a little bit lower, in emerging markets, you know, 65, 66%. In China, the share of consumption in GDP is 37%. So, you know, China has great potential to continue to impart demand to the global economy even as growth rates are slowing. And the Chinese policy, in a way, has been doing that because they have been adjusting, in some sense, internal balances that encourage, in some sense, domestic consumption. They have some cushions to support it, but on the other hand, of course, they do have vulnerabilities. The whole shadow banks, the real estate sector in China, etc., are zones of vulnerability. So yes, China has vulnerabilities, but I wouldn't say that it's a one-way kind of a bet that the Chinese growth slowdown will necessarily be a big drag on the global economy. So let me stop there. These are, sorry, I took too much time, I think. Thank you.
Now we are going to have this expose of Vasuki SHASTRY. Previously worked at the IMF in Washington for 14 years, and he is now the global head of the public affairs at Standard Chartered Bank. He also serves on the board of UK-India Business Council and is part of the Catalyst UK. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much. I'd like to add my thanks first to Marc for publishing this very interesting book on 70 years of the IMF and where do we go from here. I'd like to thank TEPAV for their hospitality. I'm going to just drop my IMF hat for the purposes of this conversation. I'm going to give, hopefully, a private sector perspective of why we think governance reforms at the international institutions are important and where we are in the current conjuncture. Standard Chartered Bank is way of a quick introduction. Big emerging markets bank, has been in Asia since 1853. So the entire emerging markets slowdown, all the hysteria about what happens to emerging markets, of course, impacts us on a daily basis. And the first question that Marc posed, really, you have increased competition in the development space, coming with the creation of the new economic institutions, AIIB, the new development bank. On the financial stability side, I would add the Financial Stability Board, really coming out of the great financial crisis as a new institution, particularly impacting the financial sector, vested with the responsibility of maintaining global financial stability. And I think the general point to make is greater competition is absolutely welcome. If you look at the World Bank and the regional development banks today, they're already facing competition on the ground from the big foundations, right? So the amount of money that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation or the Rockefeller Foundation is able to deliver to developing countries in Asia, Africa, Middle East, and Latin America, they can make a substantive difference without going through these very entrenched policy processes that the World Bank and the regional development banks have to go through, right? And from the perspective, and we've seen this on the ground in the financial sector, really, if you have a small country in Africa that wants to develop the framework, for example, for SME financing, there was a time when the monopoly of such policy advice, and indeed the monopoly of intellectual knowledge, vested with organizations such as the World Bank and the regional development banks. That is no longer the case. So you have expertise coming, I might add, from former World Bank and IMF staff, many of whom work for these foundations. They're able to really deliver policy advice to these countries in a much more rapid manner, unburdened to a great extent from politics. And of course, Amar is absolutely right that at a time of financial crisis, that's when you need these development banks and the IMF. I would argue that the IMF faces less competition in its mandate, mainly because if you look at the 2008 financial crisis, for example, members of ASEAN and Japan, Korea, and China developed a financial safety net via the Chiang Mai Initiative. Now, the most surprising thing about the Chiang Mai Initiative really is it's much talked about, but actually not implemented. So when countries such as Singapore and Korea, at the height of the financial crisis, really faced a shortage of dollars in their country, they turned to the Federal Reserve, really because we're living in a dollar-denominated economy still, by and large. And there was a reluctance, I would suspect, on the part of these countries to trigger these regional safety nets. And I think the question really to ask is, what would it take for these safety nets really to be triggered so you have a real sense that regional financial cooperation is going to work in regions such as Asia? So, so this really means that the IMF, for the moment, even though, you know, if you look at what happened in Europe with both the ESM and the EFSF resources, there's a great deal of presumption, obviously, that these are triggered with European cooperation in mind, and the IMF playing not so much a role of a bystander, but being overtly deferential, perhaps, to its European members. And that probably needs to change. The second point really is what all of this means for financial stability. I want to talk a little bit about China and a little bit about the Financial Stability Board. Where China stands today, and we're a bank with very large operations in China, we think China growing at 5% will still see China will be adding an economy the size of Australia every 3 years, an economy the size of India every 5 years if it grows at 5%. So we really, and I think the entire hysteria about a Chinese economic slowdown should be seen in this context. Obviously, there are questions asked in light of what has happened in August on macroeconomic management on the part of the Chinese authorities, communications and transparency on intent. If you look at the the RMB fix that they announced, I think from a purely technical perspective, it's a great development that there's actually a reference rate now at play, that the closing rate of the RMB on the previous day really would determine the morning rate the following day. But the way the entire thing was implemented, and I think this China does not recognize, and I think it's really the mindset of Chinese policymakers, they don't quite recognize what a powerful impact that their economy is having on the world. And they think many of these decisions, and it's ironic that a lot of pressure being placed on the Federal Reserve Board to back off on monetary tightening because that's going to have a negative impact on the global economy. I think the same yardstick the Chinese policymakers should apply to themselves, really, because their actions in the next few months, similar to the actions taken by the Fed, will determine where we are in terms of the global economy. Now, the Financial Stability Board, if you compare it with the IMF, Financial Stability Board has a staff of 34, but this is an incredibly powerful organization. If you look at every aspect of financial regulation coming out of 2008 and 2009, the FSB has played a big role. And the FSB, I would submit, has to go in the direction of greater transparency, has to go in the direction of really taking emerging market conditions into account in the way financial regulation is drafted. As an international bank, and Standard Chartered Bank is a global systemically important bank, we absolutely agree that for the big international banks, many of whom were contributors to the 2008 financial crisis, there absolutely has to be higher capital leverage and liquidity. That's not an argument I'm about to make. But we see that in many of the emerging markets, the rules that came out of the 2008 financial crisis mainly applies to these big international banks. Let me just illustrate. Over 56% of global letters of credit originate from Asia. So trade finance is very, very important for Asian countries. By the same yardstick, between 6 to 10% of notional derivative transactions originate from Asia. But we've seen the full application of global rules, which really disadvantage emerging market countries, particularly in Asia, because there are higher capital requirements placed on trade finance. And at the same time, there's a very nascent derivatives market, where a lot of the Asian companies, for example, are exporting, thus they have a requirement to hedge their foreign exchange exposure. As an international bank, we are unable, or we will be unable to operate in many of these Asian countries and offer derivatives to our clients, mainly because the way global rules are drafted, right? So I would say the FSB really should pursue what the IMF has done in recent years, and obviously the IMF governance reforms are not completely in place as yet. Has a long way to go. We'll see whether the US Congress really will ratify the governance reforms by the end of President Obama's term, which really, in a way, will acknowledge the world as it stood in 2010. And I think when looking at the governance structure of AIIB, the new development bank, I would say they've got to follow 4 rules, right? These new institutions have to make new mistakes, not repeat the old mistakes of the past. So in terms of governance, I would very quickly summarize and offer 4 suggestions to these institutions. The first one would be to come up with an independent and binding framework on shareholding structures. When econometrics meets politics, that's when you have a recipe for either gridlock or lack of consensus. So the AIIB, as it expands its membership, really needs to figure out in 5 years' time when they review shareholding structures, how are they going to do it? And ideally, they should do it in an independent fashion. There should be an element of automaticity so that there isn't a great deal of scope for political trade-offs, which really is where the IMF is today unable to recognize the relative weights of emerging markets in the global economy. Second point that I would make really is, should there be a permanent executive board sitting in Beijing, sitting in Shanghai on a daily basis, is there scope to build a new governance structure that really recognizes that the world has changed? That if you look at all the innovation coming out of Silicon Valley, that really calls for a decentralized structure. Whereas if these new institutions really try and import 20th century or even 19th century governance structures, they're doomed to face problems in the next 5 or 10 years. And the final point I would make really is in the appointment of a new CEO. The AIIB has selected a senior Chinese official. The new development bank has selected a senior Indian official. How are these reappointments or these elections going to take place in 5 years' time? Is it still going to be subject to the same political give and take, where you have this complicated, if you're a country, your foreign ministry will say, we need to support a candidate from X because there's the entire balance sheet of transactions between these two countries. How do we take politics out of this process? It's not going to be easy, obviously, this is not, but I think that the new economic institutions can really show the way by breaking from the past in really indicating that in governance, in the shareholding structure, in the way decisions are made, and in the way the leadership is appointed, they are fundamentally different from the IMF. Final point, I would make that 70 years from today, when Mr. UZAN releases the second book in this chapter, I hope we'll all look back at the last 70 years. And I hope, Marc, you're already planning to publish that book. And we'll say that indeed the international community factored in both the good lessons from the past as well as the mistakes. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now, the last speaker would be Domenico Lombardi. He's the director of the Center for International Governance Innovation, CIG, of Canada. He also serves as chair of the Oxford Institute for Economic Policy and sits at the same time on the advisory board of the Bretton Woods Committee in Washington. He holds a PhD in economics from Oxford University Nuffield College. So you have the floor, sir. I don't want to keep on going with your titles. They are too long.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador. It's a pleasure to be here at TEPAV. We'll build a very important and strong partnership over the latest few months. And of course, we are also partners with the Reinventing Bretton Woods Committee, even if I'm also a member of the advisory board to the Bretton Woods Committee, which is a different thing, just to add to the confusion. So that said, let me try to respond to your questions, Marc, in the following way. So, in the opening remarks you made and in the opening remarks that Ambassador ARAN made, there was a reference to Bretton Woods, the Bretton Woods Conference. I would say that over the past few years, we had not a new Bretton Woods, of course, but we had something similar to a new Bretton Woods moment. And this new Bretton Woods moment was the summit in Washington in November 2008, and subsequently the G20 summit in April in London, where essentially the G20 was elevated to the leaders' level. This elevation essentially built on an implicit contract between advanced economies and emerging economies, an implicit contract whereby advanced economies would provide more voice, more of a say to emerging economies, and the latter would take more responsibilities. And in this context, the lack of IMF reform, which sits in Washington, which has been put on ice in Washington, given the failure of the US Congress to ratify the so-called Seoul package, I think goes well beyond the IMF itself. In a way, it affects the G20 implicit contract I was referring to, with, of course, a number of consequences. Many of these consequences have been spelled out already by Amar and Vasuki, and I can just associate myself. So what we're going to see now is clearly a number of attempts to increase representation at the IMF through other means. One of such means is, for instance, to democratize, between quotes, the SDR basket, to allow for a broader representation of the SDR basket. There was a meeting, a sort of informal meeting of the executive board in July, and from what I understand, there is the idea that the Chinese renminbi might join the SDR basket as early as next year. So there is an attempt to broaden the representation through other means. Another consequence that we're going to see is the proliferation and increasing emphasis on regional financial arrangements, as well as plurilateral arrangements, like, for instance, the recently announced CRA. At this stage, as Vasuki reminded us, some of these arrangements are, in a way, still symbolic. They are still untested. That's true. But I think we should not underestimate the potential of these arrangements. In Asia, we do not just have the Chiang Mai Initiative, we also have Amar, the regional surveillance hub based in Singapore. And therefore, if we couple the regional surveillance hub that has recently been established with the lending arm provided by the Chiang Mai Initiative, we could say that at a very embryonic level, there is, the potential for an Asian monetary fund there. How this is going to evolve, I think it does not just depend on China. I think this is endogenous to how advanced economies, important IMF shareholders are going to act in the coming years. The very fact that after Turkey, China is going to hold the G20 presidency means that China is still experimenting with the current global governance arrangements. In other words, it's the score, has not been set yet, and advanced economies will be able to affect the final outcome in a significant way. But another development that we have observed, and again at CIGI we have done extensive research on that is freely available from our website, of course, is this, again, something that Amar was referring to. We often talk about IMF conditionality, IMF lending power, whether the IMF war chest is adequate or not. But in reality, given the increasing size of private capital flows, central banks have become a very important stabilizing actor in the world economy. Vasuki was reminding us that at the height of the crisis, Korea and Singapore did not turn to the Chiang Mai Initiative. They didn't turn to the IMF either, however, but they did turn to the Fed because the Fed is the issuer of the reserve currency that we have in the current international monetary system. And on top of that, we see a club of advanced economies central banks, so the C6, the Bank of Canada, Bank of England, the Fed, the ECB, the Swiss National Bank, the Bank of Japan. They have this network agreement where essentially they have more or less committed to provide unlimited liquidity to each other. And this is clearly a club where there are top-tier economy on the one hand, and then the second-tier economies, or the one who do not belong to the club, are in a way left out of this safety nets. And this is certainly something that we will have to look at, because in the trade area, and I know Ambassador ARAN, you care a lot about trade, but in the trade area we've seen again this proliferation of regional trade arrangements, plurilateral arrangements. But first of all, in the trade architecture, there is a way to establish a hierarchy between these different arrangements. So there is a specific provision in the WTO Charter. And in any case, possible inconsistencies that might arise from these arrangements might not be so detrimental to financial stability as if we had a regional financial arrangement with say very lax conditionality standards, or conditionality standards that would not be consistent with those of the IMF, for instance. Regional arrangements that would have a private sector involvement framework which would be different from that of the IMF. Clearly, if these inconsistencies were to arise, we would have a race to the bottom and clearly, with significant implications in terms of financial stability whenever the next sovereign crisis will erupt. I think, my previous speakers have exhausted all the other items. Besides associating myself to what they have already said, I think I have nothing else to add, and I will stop here, Ambassador.
Well, thank you so much, Domenico. Maybe I should ask Marc, are you satisfied with the answers you have received, or would you have to make some
I think,
additional
thank
remarks?
you for the panelists. I think maybe we should take this opportunity to take some questions coming from the floor, because we have a very good overview about where the system might lie in the future. Maybe Philip Turner, I see here, that can be the first to comment.
Can I ask the panel a question I wouldn't like anyone to ask me? It's the following. In the old world, the emerging market was a net debtor. So the IFIs knew what they had to do. Now in the new world, there's been a massive increase in the assets, foreign assets and foreign liabilities of emerging markets. They dominate global financial markets. Now, of course, the fallacy is to say these huge foreign asset liabilities are not a problem because the country has huge foreign assets. It's a fallacy because, first of all, there's no immaculate transfer. If the assets are held by the government, they can't be transferred simply to corporations. And secondly, there's the question of how the private sector in these countries responds to shocks will affect both the assets and the liabilities, and will have huge effects on financial markets. And this, I think, is to some extent what's going on in China now. So how should the IFIs respond to this new world?
Continue with the questions. The floor is open. Please.
My first question is, how do you get copies of this book? Because that was one of the motivations that brought me here, and I'm told that it's held up in customs. If the organizers can inform us how we can subsequently get the book, we appreciate it. And secondly, Mr. Amar, I would appreciate it if you could comment a bit on where Africa stands in all this, because we in Africa have believed that the Bretton Woods system has over the years been a great constraint on our development. Is it still the same? What does the future hold for we in Africa in the scheme of things? Mr. Amar, thank you.
Any other questions? Please. On the side.
Thank you. My question goes to Marc. With the reinvention that you are heading, do you expect the arrogance, the nature of how IMF and the World Bank has been working to change? Is it administrative? Is it the leaders? Or it is the policies? Thank you.
Yes. We have seen some people from some very high authorities from the central bank. Would they wish to ask a question? This is a very high caliber panel. Okay, if not, then I have a question. Oh, sorry.
Well, my specialty is fiscal problems. From my point of view, from the problems I'm seeing at the fiscal scene, I don't understand completely the affirmations about the progress, the important progress in regulation of the global banks. Because global banks in Europe don't provide the information, the basic information that may allow fiscal administration, tax administration, the managing of the simple control of taxes on at the most advanced tax systems in the world. And simultaneously, it's evident that the business of administering fortunes globally, the top rich, by global banks, this business in relation with fiscal paradise is a completely non-controlled business. Very destabilizing our economies at the source because of the capital flight, the tax avoidance, and the money laundering. This is my question.
I want to know your position about two things. First, the new banks, the new development banks from BRICS and the invention bank that China creates, will work in the same way that the World Bank in terms of the currency of the loans, or do you think that it will be some changes about to loan in new world currencies? This is a politic that could be. And second, the same question about the conditionality. The conditionality of the loans will be in the same way, or they could be in another way. They could be an agree to change in general in the world about the paradigm of give loans, taking in account of the structural changes that in the 90s will be the principal worry of the international institutions, or it could be changes about this?
I see none, no hands. Okay, then I have a question for the panel and also especially for Mr. Bhattacharya. He very eloquently captured the essence of today's financial system in three paradoxes. And now the question is are these paradoxes sustainable? Or would this lead to a substantial structural change in the system? Okay.
So let me begin with Phil Turner's question, and I think Phil knows my views, and it's best articulated by the chief economist of the institution that he is at, that actually gross assets and gross liabilities matter from the perspective of risk, and you cannot compare the two. And in particularly, understanding the new nature of liabilities is very important. So I won't give the example of China, but let me give which I think is a very complicated story right now, but I'll give the example of India. So in the case of India, in a world of very low interest rates and an expectation of, exchange rate stability, a lot of Indian corporates went and borrowed quite heavily to meet their financing requirements. And, that became a kind of a Achilles heel in the management of exchange rate policy. So I do believe that, not just attention to the nature of these risks, but thinking about what instruments do you have to manage these risks is something that really warrants a lot of additional thinking. And I don't believe that, there are two views out there. One is, let the markets adjust. But what we find from that is that, that there is significant overshooting and undershooting of exchange rates with significant costs on the real economy. I think Brazil is one other case that's, I think, seen that. So this is an area where I feel that, the G20 and the Financial Stability Board and the the academic community needs to focus a lot more work on. So that's on that. On Africa, I've been a champion in a previous role when I was in the G24 for making the case that Africa is seriously underrepresented in the governance of the IMF and the World Bank. And, indeed, Africa was the biggest casualty in the IMF governance reforms in terms of shares of quota, for example. If you look at the prospective role of Africa, and if you look particularly at the democratic deficit in terms of the number of people, I certainly think that one needs much greater African representation. In terms of the advice that the Bretton Woods institutions have given, there has been correctly a lot of, of criticism applied to structural reforms. But one area where I think there has been huge progress, and I believe it has given Africa a lot of dividends, has been the restoration of macroeconomic stability. I think the fact that Africa's macroeconomic house is in order has been extremely important in dealing with the current instabilities. So, as in everything else, you have to sort of take the good and leave out the bad. And I think the capacity of Africa now to do that is much greater than before. On the question of the changes in the banking side and the implications for fiscal, I've always argued that the technology for dealing with anti-money laundering, tracking of tax avoidance, and of corruption and stolen assets is exactly the same. It's not a different technology, but we need political willingness to, in some sense, use it. And I think the BEPS initiative right now, which is the G20 is championing, is a first step towards moving towards a better kind of regime. Because ultimately, one of the big areas of action has to be a reasonable kind of tax collection in order to meet the aspirations that countries have and to deal also with the macroeconomic problems. Ambassador, to deal with your last question, I'm quite philosophical about where we are. I believe that I do believe that we are seeing kind of a perfect storm in terms of weak growth and risks. But on the other side, I see a lot of what is happening in emerging markets as largely idiosyncratic. I mean, what's happening in Brazil is what's happening in Brazil. It really is not reflecting, the rest of Latin America, but it has huge impact on the rest of Latin America. And I can go on and on about. So I think in a way, addressing these risks, ultimately, a lot of it still is national actions, but the G20 can be a good way to try and ensure that the spillovers from this, are contained, and also that, there is peer pressure to ensure that we have the best global collective actions. But I feel that, there are many issues on which, the 21st century has already turned the corner, and, we will not recognize it compared to the 20th century.
Yeah, thank you, Amar. Quickly for the book, so anyone who wants to get a copy, please get back to me and just give me your business card and the book will be shipped to you, so it's free of charge. And we will put something on our website also. In thinking about the couple of questions related to more or less the future of the IMF, I think I'm thinking about two things. First, IMF was largely dominated by the G7. I think the major shift in global governance has been the creation of the G20. And the IMF now is more legitimate in a sense, is more G20 driven. In thinking about what the future lies for the IMF, I think the two key words may be interconnections, and our IMF would need to think more about the interconnection of the global economy. So maybe more emphasis will be more and more about crisis prevention. It's like in one of the articles of the book, there is a very nice piece by Andy Eldan, who mentioned about we need a type of GPS for the global financial system, how we are able with a big data revolution to detect information, to analyze information, to be able to do more on crisis prevention and to try to detect vulnerabilities in the global financial system. The BIS is doing a lot of work on that, trying to detect, and as Amar mentioned, addressing risk. I think this is one of the major challenges for the IMF in the years ahead. In thinking about where we go from there, I believe that the major challenge would be the same thing we have been thinking about China today. I think when we've been thinking about integrating China in the WTO and we are talking about trade, there was a roadmap for China to integrate the World Trade Organization. I don't think we have a roadmap for China to open up capital account liberalization, which will have a major impact for the rest of the world. So I think the challenge maybe for the IMF, for China, and for the G20 as a whole in the next 2-3 years is clearly to try to understand better what does it mean to integrate China in the global financial system, capital flows, spillovers, renminbi internationalizations, who are going to become a more multipolar world. But I don't think we have yet addressed within the IMF, within the governance, what does it mean to be in a more multipolar international monetary system.
Let me address the issue on anti-money laundering. And obviously, as an international bank, this is a huge issue of concern for us. Now, the money laundering process, it generated through crime. Obviously, things like human trafficking, drugs, money gets transferred through the international banking system. Obviously, you've got to worry about tax evasion. But if you look at the initial response of regulators really were, find fault with banks. You look at systems and processes within banks. Are they able to detect typologies? Are they able to detect patterns, which would suggest, circulating illicit money through the banking system? So we've come at a stage now where there was a lot of concern that international banks pulled out of correspondent banking relationships. Now, correspondent banking relations are absolute critical to allow developing countries access to international finance. And mainly because of the many restrictions, mainly because many banks, quite frankly, got it wrong in terms of detecting or strengthening their anti-money laundering processes. We've come to a stage now, we're very encouraged by the fact that earlier this week, Governor Marc in his capacity as FSB chair, brought together the 18 international banks and the deputies, the G20 deputies, for a meeting in New York to really discuss how we can all work together. And I think law enforcement agencies also play a critical role because oftentimes they have the intelligence, they have access to information that banks don't have. So if there's sufficient pooling of information, I think we'll reach a stage where we'll be able to detect money transfers at a very early stage, but at the same time prevent the kind of unintended consequences that are taking place now, where banks, under the name of risk management, really are saying that they don't want to have correspondent banking relationships because they will not be able to validate not only the client, but oftentimes regulators want the client's client also to be completely above board. On tax evasion, I think the G20 and the G7 have taken a number of important steps. I think from the perspective of multinational corporations, I think a good principle should be that you subsidize locally, right? So the entire tax evasion structure is built on transfer pricing, and that really is the root of the issue that the G20 and the G7 are. And we're an international bank. For example, in Africa, we're in 17 markets, subsidized locally in 15 markets. Our accounts are published. We pay taxes locally. That's probably the model to go for multinational corporations. That's the only way you're going to be able to get rid of transfer pricing. Tax evasion by individuals, I would argue, much, much more complicated. Again, you come back to how are you able to detect money transfers at an early stage.
Thank you. I think there was a question on the importance of private capital flows, gross flows versus net flows. And I think this really, what we have learned from the financial crisis is really the importance of gross in comparison to net flows. And this really points to increasing limitation in the role of IMF lending. The IMF is endowed a certain amount of money. Whatever it is of course a mere fraction of the overall size of international financial markets. And therefore, as a result, it cannot play an ex-ante stabilizing function. I think in the Eurozone crisis, we saw a similar episode where the EU, either through an intergovernmental process or through the EFSF, the Rescue Fund, and then the ESM, the Permanent Rescue Fund, was providing loans, but it was only after the ECB president made the so-called whatever it takes speech in London in July 2012 that they were able to stabilize markets. And therefore, what this tells is two things. Either we think of ways to expand the ex-ante lending capacity of the IMF, but this in turn would imply possibly allowing the IMF to issue SDRs, and I don't see that happening. Or we find ways to increase cooperation at the central banking level, and therefore we try to structure a little bit this increasing proliferation of swap networks across central banks in the world. And I think this could be an avenue to address the problem that you raised. Thank you.
That brings us to the end of the meeting. I think the wisdom, the distilled wisdom from the high minds that we have seen today have benefited us all. And we are definitely more enriched by this discussion today. And I think, could I ask you to give a round of applause to our panel? And thank you.